As I said before, I wanted to include this little piece from another nice paper as a way to bring together the various things we've been looking at in terms of reconstructing climate from various evidences, taking fossils and tools and other things to reconstruct hominin evolution, speciation, dispersals, etc., and some regional climate evidences that can also be extracted, especially combined with the models. So what are the key issues that we may have missed? So this paper proposes something from a paleoanthropological, paleoecological perspective. So climate scientists may produce climate proxies and climate reconstructions. Evolutionary biologists will do fossils and human evolution and migration and dispersal and so on. Paleoecologists may construct past ecological responses to climates, and anthropologists want to understand in a holistic way how we developed, evolved, and what makes us human. So obviously when you put them together, there may be gaps that are not filled, not only because of the lack of data and the continuity of data and the scales, spatial and temporal scales covered by the data, but also just because sometimes there are silos in which people work. So here, linking paleoecological change with hominin evolution, recent advances allow hominin paleoecologists to address challenges in understanding how ecological change influenced hominin evolution. These challenges include the need to account for gaps in the hominin fossil record. Of course, that's always a big challenge. Align the spatiotemporal scales of the empirical data and the research question, and build stronger inferences using theoretical frameworks that generate testable predictions or hypotheses. Okay, so this is just a schematic we are starting with. So let's say there is a range of hominin taxa, different species of either Homo species or ancestors, Australopithecus, Paranthropus, and there are fossil sites from which these are reconstructed. So you can see there are many extrapolations involved. Relating timing of evolutionary events using fossil record must accommodate incomplete temporal and spatial sampling. So you can see the fossil sites and the estimated range of hominin taxa don't match exactly, so there is some modeling involved, either mental models, hypothetical models, or extrapolations. Actual hominin evolutionary history may look like this. So if we go here to observed hominin evolutionary history, there are missing pieces and evidences of coexistence, in which case we don't know how much genetic intermixing happened and so on. So once you have a regional environmental record also reconstructed, we interpret the climate proxies in terms of changes in climate variability, the specific time scales. So we went, for example, from precession to obliquity to ellipticity time scale, 21,000 to 41, 43, whatever thousand years to 100,000 year time scale. So you look at the try to find relations between climate variability at the time and regional environmental record. Addressing key questions in hominin paleoecology requires careful selection of paleoenvironmental data of the appropriate spatio-temporal scale. And then once you have this information, you want to link environmental change and evolution, requiring theory-based predictions for what we should observe temporal empirically. So you put together multiple pieces of evidence, then you find gaps and so on that need to be filled, and you may need to define models and theory-based models to make predictions, and then look more specifically for new data, so driving data needs. Spatiotemporal limitations of homin fossil records, I won't go into the details, but obviously again there may be sedimentary data in some places where there are green spaces, and the actual species range may not be so let's start here, going in time from T1 to T4. So let's start somewhere here where you found species range and some evidences, but no sedimentary data. So sedimentary data is elsewhere away from where you found the species range. And then at time T2 you have found more sedimentary sites, and you have expanded your estimate of the species range, and this keeps changing over time, and now you have used the information to extrapolate into regions where there is no data. Okay, so you can see the actual range south, east, central, and north over different times appear this way in a hypothetical sense. So this is what you actually manage to observe. So you have to build models, theory-based models, to predict these, and then try to find data to match the gap of what you have already observed versus what could be the actual hypothetical range. Okay, so there are also interesting scales questions. Aligning spatiotemporal scales becomes important. Obviously, we are looking at spatial scales and temporal scales, going from 1 square kilometers to 100 million square kilometers, covering grassland habitats, Serengeti ecosystem, Lake Victoria Basin, Eastern Africa. So you can see we're zooming out all of Africa, and then the entire planet. If you look at scales of questions, you can be having typical questions like, what is the paleo environment of hominin occurrence? How did ecosystem changes affect hominin microevolution, for example, diet, cognition, which is what anthropologists worry about as well. So you can see now we have moved into larger spatial scales and range of time scales here, and this one here is what were the preferred habitats of a hominin taxon. So the temporal scale may be small, but the range of spatial scales is larger. Obviously there are overlapping spatiotemporal scales of these particular scales of questions. How did ecological change impact hominin biogeography? Did climate change affect hominin microevolution, for example, origination and extinction? And scales of evidence can be fossil trackway, outcrop sourced environmental and faunal data. So when geologic processes produce outcrops that bring up old evidences of environmental vegetation, soils, whatever else, droughts, rainy regions, and so on, over different spatial scales and temporal scales. Then you can have a glacial geological member and formation, basin and region scales at different time scales, continental and global scales. So we are going up in spatial and temporal scales here, and somewhere in the middle we sit our sedimentary core records as well. Okay, so obviously the models that we looked at with Axel Timmerman and so on try to combine those. For example, here is the humidity proxy change over time, and there is some theory that is created, let's say like optimal foraging theory, and then that defines your model and simulation of mechanics. So you find vegetations and other things, so you look for foraging regions, reproducing and moving, so you have this kind of a model built up here. So theory, example, optimal foraging theory in panel A informs a generative model, which is basically component model which integrates and produces a system and systemic response. Simulating the mechanics of a hypothetical hominin ecosystem in B. This hypothetical model simulates hominin diet in relation to an African landscape informed by humidity time series, with hominins interacting with landscape through time. Okay, some amount of time is covered by this model, as we saw two models of Axel Timmerman. One went to archaic human species, and the other one covered the later part of the Pleistocene, more recently over the last couple of 100,000 years. Right? Those are based exactly on these sorts of approaches. Models are aimed at growing alternative simulated patterns like this. Once you have a model, you validate it somehow, then you want to see what alternative scenarios can be produced to match the fossil data that is spread all over here. Just imagine this as environmental bio or paleoecological data, vegetation, so desert, rainforests, savannas, grasslands, and so on, and how they may have shifted over time with two models. In this example, the patterns are paleodietary signatures that emerge across African fossil sites under different environmental configurations. For example, arid versus humid, model 1 versus model 2. Configurations that produce outcomes similar to the empirically observed data, the gray box here. So one simulation of the model is nailed to what is estimated as reality from all the existing data. But this provides a candidate explanation that can be used to make additional predictions and further refine theoretical understanding. So once you do this, you want to come back and then tune your theory again and then go back. Wow, you get the idea. So environmental hypothesis of hominin evolution, then just briefly, numerous environmental mechanisms are hypothesized as drivers of hominin speciation and extinction, morphological change, behavioral evolution, and dispersals. Many are based on observed temporal associations between environmental changes and hominin evolution. We have implicitly already said this many times in terms of evolution of bipedalism, East African aridification, geologic changes, plate tectonics, Australia, New Guinea, and so on and so forth. Grassland expansion, this is one hypothesis. Savanna hypothesis proposes that expansion of grassland ecosystems was fundamental to hominin evolution and adaptation, including the emergence of the hominin clade. Clade is a group that lives together and behaves is organized into a dependent species ecosystem. Hypotheses linking aridity and or global cooling to hominin evolution, including Verba's turnover pulse hypothesis, which means there were multiple species that got shifted, suggests that the expansion of grasslands was a consequence of these climatic changes and facilitated the emergence of Homo and Paranthropus, for example. This turnover pulse, which led to two species and further speciation. Eastern African coastal forests, the coastal refuge hypothesis proposes that the belt of forests along coastline of Eastern Africa served as a refugium for hominin populations during harsh climate phases, and that biogeographic isolation within these refugia led to allopatric speciation. Refugia is a concept where when you have a valley or some other protected area, there may be climate change happening elsewhere, but this region is protected from it in terms of, let's say, temperature change, precipitation change, and so on, vegetation cover, and so on and so forth. So such refugia are real. They are usually found all over the places, and species have evolved to exploit them as well, or they survive if they are caught in that refugia. Environmental instability, instead of emphasizing adaptation to a particular environment, the variability selection hypothesis proposes that the key milestones in hominin evolution were shaped by environmental instability through time and space. So the question is, what drives evolution? Is it some mutation and selection, or is it that rapid environmental variability is creating new niches, and then species which can survive will survive, the others get eliminated? So this is the variability selection hypothesis. Extreme climate variability is closely related to the variability selection hypothesis, and the pulse climate variability hypothesis emphasizes the role of extreme wet and dry cycles recorded in East African record as a driver of hominin speciation and dispersal. So generally you have to not only determine how climate played a role, but whether it is the rapid changes, extreme events, or slow variability, and so on and so forth. So obviously multiple hypotheses again means we don't exactly know, right? Recurrent humid episodes, abrupt climatic shifts leading to humid conditions in southern Africa are hypothesized drivers of behavioral innovations associated with early Homo sapiens, where increased humidity promoted favorable coastal refugia, higher population sizes, and greater inter and intra-group networking. So once you have cognitive ability and expertise to build tools and so on, the way you respond to environmental perturbation will be very different than species which simply try to survive or move or go extinct, right? So this is the difference between hominins and other species, and the interaction between climate, ecology, and evolution. There are several outstanding questions, like what is the uncertainty surrounding the chronology and spatial distribution of the evolutionary milestones in hominin evolution. Previous work has focused on the temporal ranges of Eastern African hominins, but other regions and milestones, for example, technological innovations, dispersal events, and so on, require attention. What spatiotemporal scales do our proxies reflect? A better understanding of the different scales of the data will allow the comparison and synthesis of proxies that sample variable amounts of space and time. How can we more effectively synthesize individual paleo-environmental and paleoclimatic records derived from different proxies? Integrating numerous individual records will be essential for understanding the regional to continental changes that are relevant to large-scale research questions. Kind of broad, open questions. How can we develop a more robust body of theory to understand hominin evolution, and how can we better translate theory to empirical prediction? This is crucial for a stronger inferential framework and encourages hominin paleoecologists to draw from theoretical underpinnings of closely allied disciplines such as macroecology, community ecology, and paleobiology. How have biotic interactions such as predation or competition shaped hominin evolution? So when you have superposed multiple species like Neanderthals, Homo sapiens, or Paranthropus and early Homos, then what was the dynamics, predation, competition? There has been a historical emphasis on studying the climatic drivers of hominin evolution, and the role of biotic interactions demands more attention. Okay, so it's a quick run through some of the challenges and research questions that remain, and how existing records from paleoecology, paleoclimate, and evolutionary biology can be combined to not only try to answer some questions, but also define new questions by building models, and then define data needs to fill the gaps in the questions that arise. Okay, let's leave it here.